Rise.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For recognizing me, I stand in strong opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 30 minutes.
To this closed rule. And, Mr. Speaker, let me say this, that the gentleman from Massachusetts, my colleague and friend, has had a chance to sit here and blame George Bush for what was entirely this body's responsibility. I think that's an awkward position for anyone to be in, to blame the President of the United States for what we have done or what we will do. The gentleman from Massachusetts quite plainly said that George Bush and Republicans tried to hide the real cost of the war and did not put it in physical terms to where it came out for the budget where we would all understand it, and tried to hide it. Well, let me just say this, that we just passed a $800+ billion emergency spending bill that did exactly the same thing that he was saying George Bush did, Republicans did, about not being honest about what the real facts of the case are, hiding the budget money. Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is that we're here today to debate a bill that was ready to go last June. And people are blaming George Bush for our inability to get that on the floor. And I think that that's just not true. The bottom line is that this body decided through the Democrat leadership that they didn't want to move the bill forward because there was an election, and if there had been an election where tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars more would be passed by this Congress, then the American people would have seen that. Instead, they waited till after the election. So I rise today in strong opposition to this completely closed rule and to the ill-conceived underlying legislation. Weeks after my friends on the other side of the aisle continue to bulldoze their massive spending bills on the floor of the House of Representatives with no Republican input and no regular order in this Congress. This is the third time in a little over a month that I've managed to rule in this 111th Congress where my Democratic colleagues have had no hearings, no markups, and allowed no amendments by Republicans. Senator Harry Reid yesterday was quoted as saying that he is going to allow Republicans and Democrats to offer amendments in the Senate. So why won't Speaker Pelosi allow members of this House the same privilege? In an effort to encourage the Democratic leadership to uphold their promise to the American people of being the most open, honest, and ethical Congress, I think, and our Republican leadership believes, that we should hold hearings and be held accountable for what we do, including Republican feedback and amendments. And in a letter dated the 5th of this month, Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Hoyer were asked if they would immediately postpone the text of the omnibus and all earmark and spending projects included. And I ask unanimous consent to put the letter in the congressional record.
Without objection.
Yet, once again, our friends the Democrats have posted the text of this massive spending bill, which holds 9 of the remaining 12 appropriations bills, only a day and a half before the vote, and yet our letter states that in the midst of severe recession, taxpayers should have a right to read and see each provision of this legislation. Taxpayers elected each and every one of us. We should be able to evaluate the merit of each dollar of government spending that their children and grandchildren will be required to fund. I think Americans deserve better. Last week I had the opportunity, when I was back home for the break, to speak to many constituents back in Texas. And they're growing and concerned with the amount of massive spending that this Democratic majority is pursuing. Last week, President Obama signed a $792 billion stimulus package into law that consisted of over $500 billion in new spending. This week, my friends and our colleagues, the Democrats, are at it again. Now we're discussing a $410 billion omnibus for fiscal year that we're almost halfway through. The legislation we're discussing today is actually an increase of 8.3% over the 2008 fiscal year funding, which is more than $32 billion. The omnibus appropriations bill contains funding for many of the same agencies and programs that just received funds in the stimulus bill. Therefore, to uncover the true level of spending for these programs this year, the funding levels of both bills should and must be combined. The combined FY 2009 funding for agencies included the omnibus and the stimulus is $680 billion, $301 billion more than these programs received in 2008, for a combined 80% spending increase this year. 80% increase in spending this year alone. Mr. Speaker, this week the President held a fiscal responsibility summit that was attended by Republicans and Democrats. How can the President take my Democrat colleagues seriously when they spend another $410 billion after the $792 billion stimulus? There's nothing fiscally responsible regarding designating $1.2 trillion in spending in just 2 weeks. American families and small businesses are making sacrifices across this country and cutting expenses due to tough economic times. Yet this Democratic majority continues to spend like there's no problem at all. We're taking a bill that was completely marked up last year and assuming that those same needs are needed now. Republicans welcome President Obama's call for fiscal responsibility, and we are willing to make the hard choices necessary to bring fiscal responsibility to Washington. Republican leadership has called for a spending freeze, and in a letter to Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Hoyer this past Monday, we did exactly that. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to have this letter inserted into the congressional record.
Without objection.
At a time of deficits, a freeze would allow the federal government to continue functioning at current levels, just like we've been doing for the past 6 months, while showing the commitment to the American people that we, as members of Congress, are taking this crisis very seriously. Mr. Speaker, this Congress must do better than this to prevent the enormous growth of federal spending from encroaching on family budgets of Americans. I oppose this rule and the underlying legislation as it's currently drafted, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts, what purpose do you rise?
I yield myself such time as they
Gentleman is
may consume.
recognized.
Mr. Speaker, my colleagues